Neverwinter, the free-to-play MMO developed by Cryptic Studios, released to middling reviews to a PC audience back in 2013, with console releases dropping in the following 3 years. I've heard many a tale told of great enjoyment and highly savoured memories with this title, and I've always been curious to see what this D&D influenced MMO has to offer its players in the modern day. Well my friends, today is that day, as we dive headfirst into its quirky world and uncover just what new players can expect from this MMO today. My name's Mitch Mannix, and this is Ghosts of Neverwinter, the 2022 new player experience. Every adventure needs a hero, so it's to the character creation for our first stop, which within it sports a fair amount of options to customize your chosen adventurer, with a nice amount of races to choose from and of course including the locked varieties found so frequently in free-to-play games, with options such as Grumpy Child, Concerned Elf, and Musical Potato. But none of that will quite do, and with that let me introduce you to the hero of this adventure. Introducing Sir Beardquiff. Legend has it that he was born and bred exclusively in a hair salon. And with that we choose our origin and affiliation and begin our first step into the game's world. After an epic cutscene, we awake amongst a battle with invading forces and step in to assist in defending the city. After picking up our starter gear and heading into the front line, it's here where I get my first experience of the combat in Neverwinter, which to my surprise is far more action RPG focused than I would have expected. The ability to dodge incoming attacks as well as making positioning a factor does add a lot of pace and enjoyment to engagements. That, coupled with some great animations and interesting abilities, gave me a good outlook on the game's combat from the get-go. Battling further through the opening zone, we come across one of the story's first antagonists, Valintra, who seemingly still hasn't got the knack of her teleporting nonsense, and ends up poofing herself away mid-sentence. It's here during the one-on-one with the remaining Harbinger that the focus on a more action-oriented combat system over a more plant yourself and press a rotation is showcased. With the Harbinger defeated, we enter the city, and with it the first main hub of the game, Protector's Enclave. It will be clear to most by now that the visuals in Neverwinter have not aged the best of the older MMOs. Some areas do stand out with a higher level of visual fidelity, and as is typical, the more recent content does look far more up to date, but a lot of the visuals, at least in the early game as well as the NPC's expressions, still do advertise the game's nearly decade-long lifespan. Leveling through the game's early zones, the quests do well at keeping things reasonably varied, in place of any overabundance of collect X amount of these or kill X amount of that, with some humour and interesting characters thrown into the mix.
Prepare for a battle of wills for your very... You know, I'm really just not into this.
Also thrown into the mix is the constant array of boss encounters to test the player as they level, and worked well at breaking up the grind through the quests in each zone. While working my way through the early zones, ticking off quests, gearing up and smashing bosses, another pleasantly surprising element to Neverwinter's solo experience was its difficulty. As someone who has grown all too accustomed to turning my brain off while battling through mob pack after mob pack, I found that I was needing to stay on my feet when doing so in this MMO, and sometimes needing to assess the next group up ahead and plan out which crowd control abilities and prioritising targets to come out on top. It may not be everybody's sort of thing, but I love this style of gameplay, and with Neverwinter in particular, it makes it stand out for its ability to make even the early game leveling a challenge to rise to, as well as being a great tool to allow the player to experiment and understand better each class's strengths and abilities. Each of Neverwinter's zones are separate instance locations, as opposed to being one sprawling landscape, each with their own set of quests and overarching story to complete. After each zone's story has been completed, you're asked to return to the city hub to learn more about the game's core mechanics and progress the story. Two of Neverwinter's more focused elements are its companions, as well as its mount system.
Oh, Cantor. Oh, I see what you did there. Oh, very good.
Mounts not only provide the player with buffs and have their own gear set progression systems, but there's also active abilities that are usable in combat, depending on which mount you choose. Companions get a similar treatment, with a wide range to choose from, with gear sets, upgrade paths, and buffs provided to the player. My experience with the companions wasn't the best, and I'll put that down to them being newbie and barely leveled varieties, as my man-at-arms spent most of his time jumping around like a bellend, or flexing for the ladies, and my healer would literally turn tail and run away from me, just to heal himself so he didn't accidentally actually be useful. It's nice to see innovation with typically quite simplistic features, such as mounts, but in practice they don't do a whole lot to really impact how the game is played, and unfortunately contribute quite heavily to some of the real core concerns with Neverwinter, and I'll explain more on that a little later in the video. Exploring the town, typical mainstays of the MMORPG genre can be found. Auction houses, gear vendors, as well as various additional side and event quest opportunities are available.
Your timing is most fortuitous. It just so happens that I could use your assistance. Are you familiar with the weave?
Weave? No. Sabigriv is all natural, baby. A little later in the leveling journey, you are provided with a workshop, which acts as the main hub for the game's professions. Steering slightly away from the typical formats, the professions in the game, including gathering, are carried out by NPCs that you hire, as opposed to being something the player is actively responsible for. Orders to craft items and gather materials are requested and handled while the player is busy elsewhere adventuring. And although I can see why some would appreciate not having to manually gather materials, for example, it does take away from the chance to create a bit of zone identity with gatherable nodes, as well as the experience of finding that ultra rare resource without collecting them for yourself. The zones themselves, from my time with the game, do have a good amount of variety to them. Dark haunted wastes to ice-covered mountaintops, classic castles to expansive forests. A lot of the classic locations you would expect from a game built around Dungeons & Dragons are represented in Neverwinter. Each zone comes with its own set of various races inhabiting the land for both main and side quest opportunities.
Have you come to help us regain our honor?
Yes, it is, and I can really want to do it myself.
On the subject of quests, some of you may have noticed something included within the quest rewards of those provided. That being, in place of player experience, the main story quest will instead grant the player a full level on completion. This being one of the elements added in 2021 release of Module 21, a complete rework of the leveling system within the game, moving away from the previous level cap of 80, as well as the collection of experience points denoting player level. Module, or Update 21, has opted for a far lower max level of 20, and a leveling journey where the player is gifted levels as they progress through the main story. This change was made to both streamline the experience, as well as acting as a tutorial of sorts, to teach the players important systems. I can see where the developers were going with this, however it does have its drawbacks. Being happened upon by a gang of mobs while questing, previously at least came with the opportunity for a small amount of player experience. However, in this now experienceless setup, enemies that are not tied to a particular quest simply act as a means to pad out the time it takes to get through your objectives, a barrier in your way from place to place. The developers describe the change as something to make each level achieved feel rewarding, and I for one have no idea why they would think that simply talking to an NPC after finishing a quest feels more rewarding than defeating swathes of foes on the battlefield. The developers also explained in their post around the changes that it would get players to our newest and best content faster. This is true, as for when the player does reach 20, after around 12 hours of play, they'll be able to jump into the much larger sections of content, split into two main areas, these being adventures and campaigns, both being story-driven content packs with campaigns including dungeons and obtaining resources wrapped up in an unlock tree-style format. Adventures and campaigns will serve to fill out the late-game content of Neverwinter, and of course coupled with the task of obtaining ever more powerful loot, and it's with the latter where one of the big reasons why so many players' recounting of good times stays in the past begins to appear. As with so many free-to-play games as of late, progression can be all but instant by spending real cash for a number of boosters and upgrades to propel the player to the late-game content, with tokens to even skip entire campaigns to completion. If that is something that turns you off the game entirely, then you will hit that wall with Neverwinter. Players over the more recent years have reported explaining just how much content has been removed and scaled down. Systems implemented to make the choice to spend real money ever more tantalizing, and their disdain for what for them was formerly a great experience. There is even a notification to all players in a zone, informing everyone when someone gets something rare and cool from one of the crates in the game. Crates that are unlocked using keys purchased with real money. Not particularly a good look when its inclusion is such a blatant ploy to install the fear of missing out on its players. An overarching theme I see with previous player reports is that over the years the developers' decisions with the game have had a highly negative impact on its enjoyability, and moved past the justified need for the developers and publishers to make money with their product to actively sabotaging the player experience just to bump up profits. Now this video is looking at the new player's experience, so I'll summarise mine. The combat in the game, for me, is one of its best features. Not being stuck in the mud, mindlessly tapping in a rotation until the evil-looking thing falls over or sticks to the ceiling, is a real asset of Neverwinter. While leveling, needing to really think about encounters and what abilities I'm using is something that I wish was more widespread in the MMO space. The amount of content offered is enough to keep most players busy for thousands of hours, even if the storylines themselves aren't the most gripping or unique. The world and its inhabitants are detailed and varied enough to keep things fresh, with a wide variety of enemies to encounter.
Is that a bullsack with legs?
Alternative adventures and campaigns go a long way to pad out the late game, but one thing I couldn't help but feel while playing through Neverwinter is that feeling of playing a game that's clearly past its prime, and I don't mean that just in the player count perspective. I mean, does this game do enough to make it worth your time when stacked up against its competition, even within the free-to-play genre? For me, I can't say it does.
How dare you!
The game itself feels dated, both with its visuals, as well as it not really offering anything that in the modern age hasn't been played out time and time again. There are 5-man dungeons as well as larger scale encounters, which are entertaining enough, but again feel outdated and overshadowed by alternative contemporary offerings. When I play an MMO, especially one that doesn't have a heavy focus on stellar storytelling, I want to feel like I'm working towards something. When continuing to work my way through the game's adventures, taking off quests, I didn't see enough at the end of the journey to continue the grind through the game's content, not being able to find a PvP match at all, and spending an hour while queuing for any dungeon, knowing that building my character to its highest peaks will be littered with soft caps and constant nudges to visit the cash shop, and 24-hour time gates on my campaign progression just killed my enthusiasm. And although the combat is enjoyable for the most part, it wasn't enough to carry me across times where boredom began to sink in. Other free-to-play games have appeal that goes somewhat into negating the negative impact of the monetization. Warframe has insanely engaging fast-paced combat. Guild Wars 2 sports massive epic-scale PvP warfare. The Old Republic has a real focus on role-playing in the Star Wars universe, with multiple dialogue choices as well as the dark and light side system. But Neverwinter for me feels like the developers have resigned themselves to the fact that the game will never again reach the heights it once did, and are happy just to release enough content to cover themselves for the remainder of the game's lifecycle, however long that may be, whilst making sure to keep a keen focus on configuring the game to make as much in its last years via microtransactions as they can. So many systems relying on upgrades that are either purchasable or require a grind that quite simply isn't enjoyable. Neverwinter is a game that you can play for free, enjoy some great RPG combat for a while, complete a whole host of D&D inspired questlines and explore the world alone or with some friends. But for me, anything outside of that unfortunately either pales in comparison to other contemporary offerings or is too negatively impacted by the decisions made by the developers in recent years. I can see why this game means so much to so many, and how it could have once been a truly great experience. In years past, innovations such as the flanking mechanic and giving players the ability to create their own content via the Foundry system really looked to set the game apart, but due to recent design choices driven by monetization in place of innovation, those days will remain fond memories, and leave the great adventurers of days past as the ghosts of Neverwinter. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I'm really keen to get your thoughts down in the comments. Please drop the video a like if you enjoyed it, and subscribe to the channel for all sorts of MMO and RPG greatness. Thanks again for anyone making it this far into the video, and I'll see you guys in the next one.